Yeah.
So what I thought I'd do is I'd start off by introducing myself and introducing my lovely assistants who are going to be helping out, because as we have a maximum of 25 participants, it might get quite busy. And as I'll explain in a second, I'm going to try and get a lot of you to join in either in discussion or in group chat. And that will be a little bit unmanageable for me to both present and look at the group chat. So two people, Jayne Price and David Churchill, have been incredibly generous and agreed to help out with that. So Jayne, do you want to say hello?
Hello, nice to see everybody.
And David?
Hi folks.
So those are my lovely assistants who are going to be dipping in and out of the group chat and joining in. But please do feel free to jump in whenever you like. This is very, very much informal in terms of the way we're going to run it. So my name's Carina O'Reilly, and I am the chair of the BSc Postgraduate Committee. I'm also a full-time lecturer at Anglia Ruskin, and I have just completed my PhD after quite a long time. So this presentation was originally given to CIPA in Edinburgh, and it was about how to reach out kind of beyond the academy, if you like, how to engage other people with your research. And I think CIPA, which is policing research, was a good place to start looking at that, because practitioners in policing are quite often particularly hard to get to, because they're very, very busy and they don't necessarily automatically want to engage with academic outputs, as those of you working in policing will probably be going, oh God, yeah, I know. So it was a good way to start to think about that. And the other reason why I gave this presentation is because I wear several hats, and one of the hats I wear is that I'm academic editor for Policing Insight, which is a web-based magazine looking at policing management, governance, all that good stuff. And quite a lot of the time what we do is we commission stuff from people who want to get their research out there. So it's a way of getting research from academics to practitioners. And so it's a thing that I think about quite a lot, even though, and I might as well, you know, put my hands up here, I am truly terrible about getting my own research out to practitioners. So what we're going to do is, it's going to be a very interactive presentation. I want this to operate much, much more like a workshop than simply me just blathering on. And so what we're trying to do is to look at some of the reasons that academics are good or bad at getting their stuff out to other people. We're going to look at some of the ways in which we can improve the way that we get our research out to non-specialist audiences. Has everybody here been to a conference? Yeah, lots of nods. I don't know what the ratio is between postgrads on this call and early career researchers. If you've been to a conference such as the BSc, a lot of the academic presentations are great, but you will be keenly aware that some of them are not. Some academic presentations remain absolutely terrible. And I'm talking about the kind of walls of text, where you've got slides which are just simply a complete wall of text that somebody's then reading out. Many academics are also truly, truly terrible at writing for a non-specialist audience. And in my role as academic editor, I have read an awful lot of academics writing for a non-specialist audience, where even though they know they're writing for a non-specialist audience, it's completely incomprehensible. And for Policing Insight, we're fairly generous. We do tend to help a lot with the editing. One of my previous jobs, and I've worked in publishing for many, many years, I worked for a company called Jayne's Information Group, and we used to regularly commission writing on things like organised crime, for example. I was the the European security editor for that. And it was notorious that, you know, academics were terrible, and we would sometimes avoid commissioning things from academics because the editing job would be so big. What I want is to get you to think about the way that you put your research out there so that you don't make these mistakes, so that your stuff is chewable, digestible for a non-academic audience. Some people, and I'm hoping because, you know, you've come to this presentation, you won't be among them, but some people will say, well, why do I have to do that? Why should I have to pre-chew my work so that non-academics can actually understand that? So Our agenda today will start off with knowing your audience, okay? Thinking about what your audience wants and needs, and that's going to be different for each of you. And that's one of the reasons why I want this to be interactive. I would like everybody to join in, both in speech, I'm not sure what the grammar is for Zoom meetings, and on the group chat. The second stage is to know your message. And again, this is going to be really personal to you, but I've got a few little bit of interactive ideas to try to get you to start thinking about that. Stage 3 is a really short stage because this is online. A lot of this is going to involve you taking ideas home and working on them at home, okay? So I'm going to be putting, every now and then there'll be a slide that says homework. I'm very happy to send out the slides from this afterwards so that everybody can have a look. But if you want, it's quite a good idea just to note down some of the homework slides, ideas to get you going. If this were a face-to-face workshop, I'd have you doing them in the class and I'd sort of pop round and have a look, but we've only really got an hour for this, maybe an hour and a half for questions. So rather than deadly silence while you're working on these ideas that you have of your own, we'll feed what we can into the chat and then I'll get you to take the rest of it home to think about. And stage 4, which is slightly longer, is we're going to do a bit of skills work and a little bit of skills work, both on presentations and on writing for, specifically on writing for a non-academic audience. Does that all sound good? I'm going to have to get you cheering. It's just... Okay, number 1, the question. What other? So, what I want you to do is to feed into the group chat ideas why you aren't doing this already. And here's some I paired earlier. So, some I've heard from actual human beings, some of which are mine, and some which I have imagined, having spoken to people that don't necessarily reach out to a non-academic audience, why that might be. So if everybody can start typing in why they don't actually do as much reaching beyond, as much public engagement beyond the academy as they might like to, why is that? Go. And while you're doing that, and Jane and David are going to keep an eye on the chat for me, I'm going to talk through some of these, okay? So, one that I hear is that, well, if they're interested, they can read my thesis, they can read my journal article. So you know, why should I go and, like, you know, dumb it down, if you like? There's already this work here. For those of you who are still doing your thesis, I have something horrible to break to you, which is nobody is ever going to read it, not even your mum. Okay, that is going to get done. It's going to get shelved. Possibly somebody may pull it down from Ethos, that virtual shelf, and have a look at it. But they're doing that because they're doing their own PhD. They're the only people who have time for that shit. Journal articles. Yes, indeed, they are there and they are present and they are out there, but they're only out there and present. And this is really, really important when it comes to thinking about public engagement. They're only there for people who already have access to university libraries. And I cannot underline this enough, how few people have access to university libraries. Probably quite a few of you have limited access to journals even through your university libraries. I do part-time work for the University of Cambridge, partly for the library access. Journal articles you would think would be out there for practitioners and they could access them. They do not. One of the reasons, and this is honest to God the truth, one of the reasons that MPs quite often like to have students serving as interns in their offices is because the students have passwords to their university libraries and get journal access, whereas Parliament for a very long time did not, which meant that MPs and their researchers had no access to any of the journal articles that might inform policy decisions those MPs were making. So journal articles have a very, very limited audience. If you're looking for specifically for, say, policing practitioners or for probation practitioners, or you want to get your research out to any kind of practitioner, they probably have even less time than you guys do, which means the chances of them going and searching for your journal article, finding a journal article, understanding your journal article are tremendously limited. One of the things I do in my non-existent spare time is I run a very, very small and localized policing academic research summary, which I send out to local police officers as well as to policing researchers in my institution. And one of the things that happens to me surprisingly regularly is that I get random police officers contacting me saying, can you find this for me? Can you find that for me? Is there any research out on this or that? practitioners don't even have the skills to know how to go about starting this process a lot of the time, let alone the time and the access to be able to do it effectively. If you want them to know about what you're doing, you've got to take it to them. The really, really common one, and it's probably mine, and it's probably on looking through the chat, is probably the most common here, is being too busy. It's completely understandable. As you've probably gathered from what I'm saying already, I really feel your pain. I'm insanely busy. I took on a full-time job halfway through my PhD in 2016, just before my fieldwork. Great timing. And I've kept quite a lot of the part-time jobs, as well as being chair of the Postgrad committee and doing various other bits and pieces. So busyness, I really, really do feel. Let's have a look through some of the things that we've got here. Yeah, time it takes, Suzanne says, finding the time. And I've just started. That's good. There's a good reason. It's good that you're thinking about this now. Having something new to say for each piece, I think, is great, Jessica, and we'll get to that in a sec. Too early on the research. You'd be surprised, Charlotte, you'd be surprised how much worth it is, how much worthwhile it can be getting stuff out there already. Don't believe anyone will read it. Well, we can work on that. The trick is to put it in front of people, but also to perhaps couch it in the kind of terms that will make them want to read it. Less important than academic outputs. Yes, this is a really, really good point. Especially if, if you're in the middle of the ref. Then the idea of taking on work that isn't refable may seem like the world's stupidest idea. Well, the lovely thing is that, you know, ref's going to be over in a minute. And the chances are that you've been kind of already incorporated or non-incorporated. Ref counts. Yeah, it counts for your promotion. It counts for everything else that you do. But we did not get into academia for the ref, did we? Did anyone? We got into academia for other reasons, right? The reason you're doing your research is because you've got a passion for it. You've got a passion because perhaps you want to change the world in some way, or you want to find out something that nobody's ever known about before. You want to change the world, or you want to share knowledge. Well, that's got to be about getting it out to people, right? Other than just other academics. So there is, I think, something about intrinsic motivation, something about who we are and why we do this that makes the public engagement so important. And no, it probably do nothing for your career officially, not on the boxes that we all have to tick. But in terms of feeling that you've made a difference and what you're doing is worthwhile, which is the kind of thing that will actually get you through those periods of being refed or marking, which for me is the seventh circle of hell. The thing that gets you through that is knowing that actually at the end of the day, there is something, you are worthwhile. Your work is worthwhile. It's contributing to something. And that, I think, is really, really important to keep in mind. Teaching workload, Amy. Oh, God, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Teaching workload has just completely overwhelming for many of us. And it's a busyness, isn't it? We have so much busyness. We have so much to do. Not wanting to write it all up and publish it before I put it in your own. That's a really, really interesting, really interesting thought, Suzanne. I think that sometimes it's a good idea to perhaps get something written before you start engaging, because there's a way of kind of knowing what you think, right? So it doesn't have to be before you've written your thesis, but sometimes it can go alongside. Sometimes it can be more of a commentary, and I'll come back to that in a little bit later. Not knowing who your audience is will definitely work on that. Yeah, and needing to influence policymaker. Oh, we are all over that, David, all over that. Some other things that I've come across, and apologies for jumping back and forth to the slides here. I don't know how to write for the Beano. I think that's one I actually genuinely heard back when I was working for Jayne's. It's a different style of writing. Writing for a non-academic outlet, getting your stuff out there is a different style of writing. Frankly, if you manage to get into the Beano, I was once asked to come on to Newsnight, and I am telling you, that was the high point of my entire career, and possibly still is. Being able to simplify your work so that practitioners can read it is just a tremendous skill that's just worth learning, because it helps you with everything else. If you want to talk to people, you wouldn't become an academic. Well, yes, that's very true. I promise you, you won't have to actually talk to anybody face to face unless you want to. And what if somebody steals my ideas is another one that I came across. And actually that is in some ways a risk, but it's a risk every time you put any part of your work out there. All right? Every time you make a grant application, every time you have a conversation at a conference. To an extent, you just have to have a certain amount of faith that, you know, we are all on the same side in criminology. I can't make any promises for any other discipline, but we're lovely. Okay. Benefits of getting it out there, the benefits of public engagement. You want to get your finding under the noses of the people who can use them, right? And David, you spoke of that. What people do you want to what people do you want to engage with, David? Who are the practitioners?
Yeah, well, I've already given evidence to Parliament, and I've already spoken at conferences, and I've spoken to the public. And I'm a consultant with police, but it comes. But I really need to start squeezing people. You know, I really need to start using more influence on people who can change policy, because I work in the field of disability hate crime. I'm one of the few, and we need to change the context. So I just need to sort of change my approach a little bit, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting, because to an extent you've already done some of this stuff already, haven't you? You already thought about, you know, becoming an expert in your field and being somebody that people can reach out to. Anne, you said you're looking at practice-based. It's probation.
Right, yes.
Is it is it practitioners you're looking at getting your stuff out to?
That's well.
I know you're at the beginning.
Probably, but also because you're right. I'm doing this because I want to change the world of probation, which, as you'll know, has had a very torrid time over recent years. So ideally, I want to pitch it. I want it to be something that practitioners access and that they think, yes, that's my experience, that makes sense, and that can support me in my practice. But I also want to change the way that people of influence and the general public view the world of probation, which at the moment is either non-existent or they're the ones that keep failing to supervise people who go and do terrible things to other people.
Yeah, it's really.
So that's quite a lot, really.
But it's brilliant, though, because one of the things I was going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you to do in a second, is start to think about potential audiences. So what you've done already there is you started to think about a range of audiences. I mean, not just the people, the practitioners who can make the decisions, but also the idea that actually getting this out to a general population, a general audience, is worthwhile as well. So that's absolutely brilliant. Just a couple of other benefits that I want to throw in there. So we've got improving your communication skills. I mean, none of this is ever going to be bad for you. If you're at the beginning of your career and you want a career in academia, anything that gives you confidence in presentation skills or comms is always, 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 always going to be worthwhile. Being able to write quickly and easily and with facility and fluency will do you so many favours going forward. It'll make it easier to apply for grants because you'll already have begun the work of actually saying, what is the essence of my research? Why is it important? And why should people care and give me money? You know, all of that is really, really useful skills that you can take forward. And it helps you rehearse your arguments. And again, if you're at the beginning of your career, to pad out your CV in ways that you can then show to people, look at it, it's great. Look at my impact. Okay, so that's why this is a great presentation. You're really glad you're here. Right, let's start. Let's do some stuff. Okay, I've been blathering on too long. So let's start with knowing your audience, all right? And this is really, really important. So what I want you to do is to dive in and do a bit of brainstorming. So we'll use the chat for this. And what I want you to do is start thinking about the possible audiences for your research. So if everyone can just dive into this and be as precise as you possibly can, because we all think to ourselves, oh, well, I want other academics to read stuff. But do we actually think, well, which academics, you know, which disciplines, which fields should be reading my stuff? For example, I've been doing quite a lot of work in neighbourhood policing and in values in policing. That's the subject of my thesis. But actually, when I think about which academics I'd quite like to be reading my stuff and maybe who I'd like to work with in the future, there are other academics out there. And that makes a difference for how I think about what journals I might want to publish in. There are academics who are working in things like community engagement for the public sector more generally. Perhaps it would be good if I was talking and reading and working with them. There's some theoretical work around political realism. I want to be talking to those realists as well. So think about which fields precisely in academia. Practitioners, who precisely? When you're talking about, perhaps David, when you're talking about perhaps which police officers you might be thinking of, you've got quite a lot of experience. Think about your research, who in the scale, who in the hierarchy might be needing to read this. And if it's everybody, if it's the bottom and the top, well, okay, but then do you need to present it slightly differently? Do they need to be doing different things with that? We'll move on to that next. So we will come to how you adjust a message for different audiences. But just for this, I'd really like you just to start brainstorming who precisely. Policymakers, where? Do you mean policymakers at local government level? Do we mean policymakers at national level? If it's national level, which ministries? Which departments are we talking about? Are we talking about MPs? If we're talking about specific MPs who show an interest, which MPs? And that matters because if you already know, for example, which MPs are interested in the things you're interested in, well, you can send your research directly to them. You can produce something for those MPs alone and get it to their researchers. Do you see what I mean? So as you start working on this stuff, the more precise you can be about your audience, the better. So Amy, I can see that you've already started thinking about this anyway in that last comment about the migrant and refugee communities. That's a really, really interesting thing. I really, really like that, Amy Clark. So again, members of the public, why? Why do members of the public want to see, why does the general audience want to look at your stuff? So have a go at that, dive in, think about the academia, practitioners, policymakers, members of the public, and feed the ideas into it, because this is a way we can all learn from each other as well.
I think that's an interesting point, isn't it, Carina, that Amy said, you know, if we're thinking about the sort of the breadth of people that we're trying to access as well, in terms of, you know, it's this how we pitch it to these people.
Yeah.
But yeah, just
I really
adapting
like
it for various audiences, how we get to them and how we access them, and I think that's a really important point, like how we support sort of those vulnerable groups that maybe we'll sort of do some research with, and how we hopefully try and support those people as well. So it's not just about targeting you know, these higher levels of policymakers to make this change, also accessing these groups so that people can, as Amy says, you know, advocate for themselves and you know, helping people, as you said earlier.
I think it's such a good point. I think it's an amazingly good point. I think it's so important. I think it's probably something worth putting, you know, working into this presentation in the future, because a lot of the things that we'll talk about today are still going to be, you know, basic skills for reaching people who work and think in areas that are similar to ours, or at least familiar enough, so we know kind of roughly how to reach them. So, you know, how do we reach communities that perhaps don't look like us as academics? How do we? What could we produce? What kind of output could we produce? One of the things I'm increasingly interested in is the way that some academics are kind of thinking sideways in terms of public engagement. Recently, I produced for some Essex police officers, I produced an infographic to start talking about community policing and the different things that feed into public confidence. So infographics might be something worth thinking about, which would be, you know, there would definitely be a kind of session by itself, wouldn't it? But also perhaps YouTube videos. Could that be something that you start producing and putting out there? I know that some use games and gamification to try and get their findings out there. So there's all kinds of interesting ways that we can do that, and to put that out there. Let's have a look at what people are saying.
Yeah, we also have a interesting point from Jessica about how the people who make decisions aren't necessarily the people at the top. And so kind of going to Department of Justice or wherever, the person who might be making the decision in your area is not necessarily the minister or the key civil servant, but might be a leader of a particular subgroup or something like that. So it's identifying the key person within an organisation there. I
think that's really important. Yeah, absolutely. And there will be interest groups. I mean, one of the things I think that's always worth thinking about is thinking below the level of ministries to, well, who are the opposition people that are looking at this, as well as those who are in government, because no government lasts forever. And if there's, you know, if there's a likelihood that a new government might be more open to what you're doing, that's also worth it as well. So yeah, you've got lobbying groups as well, and how do you get to them and how do you get your stuff out there? Academics, wider academics, yeah, lots of different disciplines, Suzanne. That is a hell of a lot of disciplines that'll feed into, and there's an awful lot of potential audiences there, isn't there? Not just in academia, but also out in the bigger, wider world. Let's have a look.
Voluntary organisations.
That's a really, really good one. Yeah, and see, Suzanne's already identified the main MP working in that area, which is great. Gambling legislation, voluntary organisations. So This is absolutely brilliant. This is absolutely great. This is a really, really good wide range of potential audiences. And the chances are that for each of you, you have, you know, more than one priority audience. You have lots and lots of different audiences. And so what it's worth doing is actually trying to spend some time writing a list of the potential audiences that you have, because, and members of the public who gamble, yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, some of your audience may kind of overlap in terms of how you might want to get your messages to them. So, you know, had you produced a beautiful infographic, that might be something that you can put out to more than one place. But others are going to need a completely different approach, and you're not really going to start knowing that until you start matching, until you start listing, you know, the messages, the things that you want to do with them, and the different audiences, and how you're going to go and do that. Stage 2 then is knowing what your message is going to be. And this is particularly tricky, I think, if you're fairly early in your research. Because you're not even sure necessarily what the message is. If you're about halfway through a PhD, or if you are now moving on as an ECR, then the chances are that you do know what the main message of what your research is, but you may also kind of start to understand that actually there is more than one output to this. So I want you to do a quick, really annoying exercise. And that is, especially if you're a PhD student, okay? But even if you're not, if you've graduated recently, then using your thesis for this is quite a useful one. And if not, if you've got kind of a recent piece of research that you can think about, and that's what I want you to do, is I want you to summarize your research in just 7 words. And some of you may have done this before. I find it incredibly useful. It was one of the most useful things that I ever did as a baby PhD student, was to attempt to summarize my research in 7 words. And it's incredibly useful when you're early on, all right? So everybody wants to have a go at that. That'll be brilliant. And leave your mics on so I can hear you howling and swearing. And I'm going to try this too. So I'm going to be typing and deleting for quite a while.
I just think it's funny to when people that aren't really in the same field, how they understand what your research is. So my like family members would be like, she's doing something about prisons. Like it would always be like loose, you know, it was always like loosely defined. So having it in 7 words is really useful to try and pitch it to anybody, isn't it?
Yeah. That's one attempt. I could probably do lots and lots of different attempts. This is great because I also get to be really nosy and read about all your research. It's fabulous. Regulating transfer of DNA data across borders. What is probation for? Virtual reality to study residential burglary. That's so cool. Oh my God. Exploiting the harms of women's online gambling. Exploring, sorry, not exploiting, Suzanne. I really do apologise. How neighbourhood policing reveals value clashes. Impact of sexual history evidence on mock jurors. Charlotte, you've got really interesting methodology for that, haven't you? Just hiding under the table.
Sorry. Mock jury deliberation.
Transition between child and adult prisons. God, that's so cool, Jayne. That sounds really interesting. I love this. It's just, people are doing so much interesting research, aren't they? Racism, prejudice, and discrimination, new arrivals. Examine why disability hate crime is ignored. Everyone else sounds much more interesting. That is actually, yeah, I know the feeling. Meanings and experiences, citizenship for prisoners, the traumatic intergenerational impact of maternal imprisonment, coercive control, lack of judiciary awareness. This is great. You guys are fab. So this is like a really, really interesting and enormous range of different research. Was that a useful exercise, everybody? Does anybody think it was shite? I'm going to go with Suzanne saying yes because it was useful, not shite. Yeah, thanks for reassuring.
Timing.
It is difficult. It is really difficult. So the first time I tried this, it was kind of torture. But I just find it's a really, really useful exercise to focus your attention down. And one of the things that you might find is that actually you're just kind of repeating what has ended up being your title, or that you have just a single finding if you're towards the end. What you might also find is actually there's kind of probably more than one potential message that you could bring out of your research. And that is not only okay, but it's predictable. What you might want to do, and I want you to think about this rather than do anything about this for the moment, is think about what your main message is from your research, but also think about what core message is from your research that you want to share with your top 3 audiences. So in this sense, although summarizing your research in 7 words may have been difficult, it's not your summary is not necessarily your message, is it? So to say that the judiciary, for example, doesn't have a great deal of awareness about coercive control might not necessarily match with the message that you want to get out to your various audiences, which might include academics, which might include members of the judiciary, which might include the general public, which might include those pressure groups. So what you might want to think about is, how do you match the different messages from your research with your top 3 audiences? Okay, so if you can be thinking about that in the background as we're going ahead. And the next thing that I want you to think about is what your audience is, what it is that you want your audiences to do with your messages. So sometimes when we do this, especially with people who right at the beginning of the research, they will say that they want to raise awareness, right? So what, why? Why do we give a shit about awareness? Well, what is awareness going to do? Is it going to change anybody's behavior? If it is, then think about what behavior you want to change from that. So awareness by itself may not be useful. See if you can go beyond it. Do you want people to gain knowledge, or which particular knowledge, and what might you want them to do with it? So, not just think about, the most basic form of what are they going to do with this message. See if you can go beyond and think about something that's action-based. So do you want to change decisions? Do you want them to take this extra knowledge, incorporate it into their future research? Do you want this to pressurize this person to change policy? Or do you want practitioners to change their behavior? So let's have a bit of a think about that now, okay? And just without spending too much time on this, just if you can think of anything immediate, an action that you want one of your audiences to take as a result of seeing your research. So have a go at that now. And again, feedback in the chat. And we'll discuss it while we're doing it. David, I'm going to put you on the spot, not David Wilkin, David Churchill. So tell us a little bit about what your research is about.
Crumbs. Well, I'm just about to start a new project, actually. So let's talk about that one. So that's about the history of the security industry.
The what industry?
Sorry, the security industry. Security companies. Yeah. So that's
and the reason I'm picking on you, David, and being particularly evil about it is because I know that what you tend to work on is historical criminology. It tends to be the background to stuff. So this is a particularly difficult question to ask you to think about, isn't it? Historians in general. I mean, I've got a lot of friends who are historians, and although some do tremendously kind of relevant work about, for example, American racial politics in the 1930s. Others are largely obsessed with obscure 18th century liberal politicians, which is just not, How do we do the thing with your kind of area? How do you make that, what's the purpose of getting your stuff out there in the world?
Well, I mean, I guess the general thing, like, it's just a way of finding something to hang it on, if that makes sense. Finding what in some way, like, there's some reason why you're interested in the thing, and there's much stuff that's of interest in it. So it's a case of kind of matching that up with someone that it kind of resonates for them, and it makes them. It might not necessarily like give them the answers, but it might at least help them to look at something in a different way, and that might in turn lead to some change of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I have to say I really like reading David's stuff, so he is certainly kind of getting incorporated into other research, and I think it's great. I really enjoy it.
Thanks.
Okay, so we've got a few people feeding in here, and I know this is actually quite tricky, so I'm not expecting like vast swathes of input here. So Jessica, policy makers properly engage with scientists to make sure the law can actually work in practice. Can you tell us a tiny bit more about that?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so with my research, a lot of it, because it's actually based in Australia, and the legislation is written because it's criminal law at both the state and the federal level, so there's a lot of discrepancy across the jurisdictions. But in addition to that, what's actually written in the law can't actually work in practice. So they say about taking a hair sample from somewhere, but they say it has to be taken individually. So what is the scientist supposed, the person doing the collection supposed to pluck each hair individually?
Yeah.
Or can they just take one sample and just do it properly the first time? So just like really practical based things that they don't consider because they're not actually the ones who have to carry out the forensic procedure on the individuals.
See, that's a brilliant example. It's a really, really good example because it's a very tailored message to a particular audience, right? Although you could probably share that to a wider audience because, what you want is to get policy makers to look at this and go, this is a stupid law, we should change the law, right? But how do you get policymakers to do that? Well, you have to put pressure on them through different means, which means you have to look at sub-audiences almost, don't you? You have to think about how could you make that wider known, or what kind of people could put pressure on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, for my dissertation, because I'm just finalizing it at the moment, part of it was my data collection method was interviewing those who are actually part of the process of DNA data exchange, so those who actually affect the processes, to understand what works for each group and what doesn't work between them. So it's sort of like the people I've spoken to are the people who are my interest groups within that.
Well, that's brilliant as well. I mean, that kind of gives you a way of accessing as well, doesn't it? In some ways, the way that we feed back from our own research as well to our participants, and the way we got in touch with our participants in the first place can help us with getting to that audience. That's really, really good. Thank you for that. It's such a good example. And there's loads here, which I'm not going to kind of read through, but there's Amy Clark, again, I just want to have just pick up on this as well, because I think this is a really, really interesting thing in terms of being a very specific message to slightly different audiences there. So I like that you've gone from raising awareness there to an actual action. It's about changing limited and exclusive perceptions of what constitutes racism and who might be a victim. And so you're talking about academics and practitioners who think about training on hate crime and discrimination policy. So there's all kinds of ways in there, aren't there? There's all kinds of actual possible audiences just within that, right?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, so I was thinking about my own recommendations that I actually wrote in the thesis, but yeah, definitely is changing some of these definitions almost on every level possible.
Yeah,
I think if I wanted to start anywhere, actually the academic community might be a good place to start, and because we teach, so we need to obviously make sure that our teaching is research led, and actually if definitions can be broadened to be more comprehensive and inclusive, then that I think I can get people on board with that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's great, because you're already kind of flagging almost a route, aren't you? You're already starting to plan out where the arrows go and how you can get that research out to people. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's really, really good stuff. So what I want to do then is to start getting you to think about your cunning plan, and this is how you're going to get from A to B and all the way through. And if we were doing a face-to-face and we had kind of whole afternoon, what I would do is I would get you to do this, and I'd be coming around and getting you to work in small groups and sharing this and stuff. What I think is worth doing for everybody as homework, if you like, is to draw up a list of the possible audiences and think about some of the things that we've been talking about in the chat so far. Think about, which are each of these audiences, perhaps rank them in order of priority. So if you've decided that actually the most important thing is to perhaps translate some of the recommendations of your thesis directly to practitioners, that should be the top of your list. If you think that you really like to get the stuff in front of policymakers, but you're aware perhaps that that's going to be quite difficult, well, think about who can put pressure on policymakers, and then you can expand your audience a little bit and then move that into the priority list. And then what you want to do is think about your message, but refine it for each of them, because it should be a little bit different in each case. Okay, your message that goes to a practitioner has to assume a lot of frontline knowledge, but not academic knowledge, for example. Your message to academics perhaps shouldn't assume a great deal of frontline knowledge, because especially for people, there's a few people who are working in a quite interdisciplinary manner. And so you can't assume that they're even necessarily going to know the parts of your discipline. If it's the general public, you can't assume any knowledge. So Your message should be slightly different for each. And the process of doing that really gets you to understand your own messages better. It helps you understand, for me anyway, it helps to understand your own research. And the next one, think about how you're going to reach each of these audiences. And this does require a little bit of brainstorming. You want to think about the different ways of getting stuff out there. So we've talked about a few of these already. And I don't want to spend too much time brainstorming on that now, but we can think about, you know, strategies to reach academics, journal articles, right? That's a very, very good way of doing it. But there might be other things as well. And we'll come back to this in a little while. Prioritize what's most important, and then, and this is really important, draw up a plan. So almost everybody was talking about just being so busy that it's hard to think about how you're going to fit this in. So perhaps think up a plan. You know, do you need to wait a little bit until you've got some findings, or is there something that you can start getting out there already? If you can start getting stuff out there already, well then, you know, book a space in your calendar. Say, by the end of this month, I'm going to get this message out to these people, even if it's just a rough thing that nobody ever actually sees. Or by the end of this one, I want to have found how I can get this message out to these practitioners. And we'll work a little bit on that as well. Does that all make sense, everybody? Tell me if it doesn't.
Yeah, it does.
I was hoping for a silence after that, but it was the right answer, so we'll go with that. All right, skills. This is me proving that I'm down with the kids. So what we're going to move on to for the last half of, well, I say last half, we're kind of well past half, for the last section of this is we're going to look at some skills-based work, particularly on presentation skills and then on writing for non-academic publications, okay? So if you feel really confident in both of those, you can go off and, I don't know, make a cup of tea, have a fag, whatever people do these days. I have no life, I just sit in this chair in this room all my time. So I'm going to start with presentation skills. Now, why are so many presentations so dull? Please don't tell me if mine is included in that, I just don't want to know. 3 reasons that I would normally give for bad presentations, and I do quite a lot of presentations with my students and they're normally absolutely painfully awful, God love them, no matter how much I try to help them with this. The 3 main reasons are presentations that are really poorly organised, presentations that are overwhelmingly just text and people are simply reading out from the screen, and presentations that are really badly delivered. Anybody that has seen a student presentation will feel the pain of all 3 of these. Presentations that are poorly organised. A lot of the time when people have not got a lot of experience with doing presentations, they won't really think or plan them very much. So for example, early PhD students will quite often produce presentations for their conference that is probably 10 out of 12 slides are about their literature review. And the reason for that is that when we're early in our research journey, if you like, we don't really have a lot of faith in our own findings and our own research. What we have faith in, because in a way that's kind of what we're being taught to by the process in that stage of our PhDs, what we have faith in is other people's research. And because it's for the first time that we've ever brought this together, and perhaps we have found new insights through bringing this literature together, we feel that the literature is bringing all of these tremendous insights. And so we produce conference presentations that are all about this tremendous insight of the literature and with maybe 2 slides of what we've actually done. It's poorly organized, okay? What people are there to hear is your stuff, your research. Too much text. And that is quite a lot of the time, especially if you don't have an enormous amount of teaching experience, you're afraid you're going to forget important things. And the trick to remember with that one is nobody knows what it is that you've forgotten if you don't tell them. So as long as you don't tell them that you've forgotten loads, kind of doesn't matter, you're going to get away with it. Too much text is, again, it's a kind of insecurity. It's about not having confidence in yourself and not having confidence in the idea that you've put this presentation together and you know how to deliver it. And the final part is bad delivery, which yet again is about confidence. And again, if you've ever sat through a bad student presentation, you will know that they kind of look like this, and they're very quietly there and they're desperate to get away from, and oh my God, it's diabolical to listen to. And sometimes people will kind of do something similar in conference presentations. You see fewer of those because actually most people talking about their own research, even if they do wait till the last 2 slides to talk about it, flower and blossom when they're talking about their own stuff, because it's their own stuff, because they're excited about it. And what I want you to be getting to do is to be producing presentations that are all the flower, without any of the kind of turgid compost that you have to wade through before you get there. We're not going to get a great deal done in 10 minutes, but what I just want to do is just flag up some points that you can take away with you, really, to think about things. Has anybody got a conference presentation or a similar presentation to coming up soon? I mean, a lot of you won't have because pandemic. Has anybody got anything that they have to think about shortly about presenting their work?
Could I add a point here?
Yeah,
absolutely. Is that I've been doing presentations for too long. You know, I've bored thousands of people. But what I found years ago was, when I was trained how to do it, was the principle of the presentation should be the person, not the presentation. And so I often do presentations without slides. And I once attended, because I used to be in business, I once attended a presentation and the speaker had 136 slides. And somebody at the meeting just said, email it to me, and walked out, because they just didn't have the time for it. So make it all about you, is what I say, because that makes it special.
I've got a story to add to that, David, that's quite similar, and it's about how I learned to stop worrying and to love being able to do things off the cuff. I was working for Jayne's, and we'd gone over to Brussels, and it was I think it was the European Parliament's researchers, so library researchers, and we were there to present on European security issues. And unsurprisingly, I think, all of us, although we were experienced researchers and kind of experts in our field, were so insecure and nervous about this that all of us on the world desk, if you like, had prepared very content-heavy presentations. And so what I thought was the most important thing in my area at the time was the Balkans. I really presented something that for me was very fascinating. It contained insights they might not have known, and was very, very content heavy about Bosnian politics. Trust me, it was interesting to me. And I was really, really nervous. I kept thinking, well, these guys are going to know more than me. You know, I can't just I've got to prove that I know what I'm talking about. I've got to show that I know what I'm on about. Along with us, all of us on the world desk, if you like, we also brought along a stringer. He was a guy who'd worked for us for years and years and years, general security issues, and he had brought a presentation that he probably prepared, thinking back now, he'd probably been delivering the same presentation for about a decade, and for some reason he kept banging on about pointillism, and the kind of five of us on the world desk sat there, kind of with our jaws slowly dropping as he just blagged it. I mean, he blagged it. It was utter superficial bollocks that he delivered with enormous confidence and panache. But at the end of that, we were all looking at each other going, bloody hell, I can't believe he got away
I think
with that.
if you can get them laughing, you've won the presentation. Get them laughing.
Well, this is it. We're all thinking, I cannot believe he got away with that. I cannot believe that he even had the gall to do that when it was so obviously just, superficial nonsense, until we got the feedback forms. And guess what the feedback form said? All of these incredibly intelligent and very, very knowledgeable European Parliament researchers who come to watch our terribly informative presentation about Bosnian politics liked the idiot with the pointillism. Yeah,
that's why they call the feedback forms happy sheets, isn't it? Because you're probably going to change your.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a lesson that I have never forgotten, which is actually the content doesn't matter that much. Now, granted, if it's a conference presentation, you probably don't want to completely bullshit it. You do actually want to have some information and reliable information on there. But the presentation is the bit that matters. It's the delivery and the planning matters so much more than filling the screen up with content. So really, really do go for, if you're not confident, that's okay. Pretend you are. They're not going to know. So there's a bit of homework that I'm going to talk through, and again, for you guys to take away. What I want you to do is, if you're planning a presentation, or if you've got one that you think might be worth working on, is to storyboard it. And I'll show you an example of a storyboard in a second. And that's to think about, in a very systematic way, what is going in each slide and why, okay? And I don't want you to fill it with content in this storyboarding. It's only got a word or two indicating the content. What I want you to do is to think about the design and the visuals of it. So, for example, when I was designing this, I knew that I wanted something that was focused largely on visuals and not on content, because I wanted to demonstrate that visuals were a useful thing in an online, particularly in an online environment, that having it full of content would have actually been distracting. So that was a deliberate choice about this. If I were teaching, I'd probably have more content, but again, limited so that it links to other learning, rather than saying, copy down this slide, this is what you're supposed to be doing. So this is an example. Okay, so this is storyboarding where you've got some very, very simple indication of what's going to go onto each slide. You've got an indication here that there's going to be a bit of a storyboard. You've got some indications of pictures here. And what I'd like you to do as a bit of homework is to try this and think also about what kind of images you want in there. Okay, just try and think about that in advance. And you may find that by doing this, especially if you do it the pre-existing presentation, that the process of just planning it out makes you think, why have I got 5 slides on that? That could fit on one. Oh my God, I'm so dull. That's not how it works for me anyway. And 2 other elements. I want you to think about what your hook is. So if anybody's planning a presentation or thinking about one, think about every good presentation is what you're trying to do is you're trying to drag people in it. You know, you're glad you came into this room, now sit down and stay there. Okay, why should anybody be interested in your presentation? What's it going to do? All right, so if you've got one on the go, then tell me in the chat in a single line. And if you'll remember, the hook that I had right at the very beginning in ours was, in this one, was about a lot of the stuff that you're going to see when you go and see other conference presentations is dull. Yours isn't going to be. So that's my hook. That's how I'm going to drag people into it. Okay, so have a think about that. All right.
Just quickly, Carina, we've got an interesting chat going on about the value of like lunchtime seminars or departmental work in progress things and whatever. Yeah. I think that's kind of a good point in that kind of like you can often focus on the big conferences, but often there you're squeezed in with such a short slot and you only get to talk to like 2 people about, you know, in the room at that time. They're good for other things, but actually like a more relaxed, more informal seminar can be actually much more useful in developing an idea.
It's a really, really good point that both that you make, David, and I think Jayne was talking about as well. And I would say that especially for those of you who are thinking about audiences and practitioners in particular, one of the things that you could do almost just to kind of have a practice, because you've already got these connections and these contacts, is think about just going back to the people that you worked with, the people that you originally contacted, perhaps to the people that you tried to contact but couldn't, and say, I would like to do a seminar with you explaining the findings of my research. Do you have time? And offer to just put something on for them. And that gives you a chance to practice developing this stuff, to practice giving, you know, something which can be a little bit scary. It gives you a chance to practice with people that actually kind of already know you. And with whom you've already got a comfortable relationship with. So it's really, really worth doing. And probably most of your institutions will have regular seminars and presentation opportunities as well. Research seminars where staff can present, or where PhD students can. And if they don't have anything on at the moment, if there's nothing online, think about starting something. Think about getting together with other ECRs in your institution or other postgraduates in your institution and saying, well, why don't we just catch up with each other's research while we're all stuck at home? Why don't we just do a quick, you know, everybody each week, somebody does a presentation. It'll only take half an hour, presentation and questions and answers. And it's a way of really kind of engaging and practicing and being confident. And because the process of doing this, it all refines your ability to get your message across in different ways. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks, David, for bringing that to my attention. It's awesome. My next point was simply going to be about takeaways, and about a lot of the time, again, when we try and put presentations together, we structure them almost like we would a paper. What we don't tend to do is to think about what people take away from presentations. And although I spoke about the hook and said how it's important to drag people in, the most important thing they're likely to remember when you leave that presentation is the last few slides, okay? So for example, I think on the last slide I'm showing you guys, I'm giving you my email address. No, the important thing is to think about what is the one thing your audience should take away from your presentation, and that should be your conclusion. It really shouldn't be a kind of dreary wandering off at the end. So think about making both your beginning and your conclusion really, really powerful. And the beginning, just carrying people with you. It doesn't have to be super content heavy. Okay, does anybody have any questions about that part? I've thrown in the slightly ridiculous animation there because we do have tools, you know, at our fingertips. We have tools that PowerPoint can give us, including animations, although limit them because you do end up kind of giving people a headache after a while. And I tend to not use more than one animation per entire PowerPoint presentation, but it is worth considering them. Consider using more complex animations. Here is just a simple animation that allows me to choose how much of these you can see at one point. Think about integrating interactive activities. In the live version of this is the point at which I have a Star Trek version of my presentation that comes in scrolling across the screen, disappearing into a star field. Think about interactivity, including when it's online. Can you ask the audience questions? How many people here think that you can ask the audience questions in an online presentation? Raise your hand or give a thumbs up. Right, you see what I did there? And rehearse. Okay, confidence is all about rehearsal. It's much, much easier to do a presentation for the second or third time. So absolutely rehearse everything that you do. Right, if nobody's got any questions on the presentation element of this, I'm going to move straight on to the final element. Is that okay?
I've got a quick point,
oh, yeah,
if I may. I saw a tweet the other day and I thought this was really useful, that you can actually do, if you go into PowerPoint and go on review, there's a button which says check accessibility.
Oh,
so you can see if there's pockets where there's like hard to read text, or just where there might be issues where people, you know, it just might make the presentation inaccessible for certain people. So it's just a useful thing to sort of maybe review your presentation as well at the end.
Yeah, I have actually noticed that's coming up on my Mac now, that it's going through and just giving me a kind of little green signal at the moment if my stuff's accessible or not. It's a bit of a horror show how much isn't, but usually the presentations are. So it's just my ordinary writing that's terrible. The PhD, big red line. Okay, so for the final part, and I know we're moving on in time, so if anybody does have to leave, it's absolutely fine, don't worry about it. Writing for non-academic publications. So do a bit of a brainstorm in the chat, and what you think about is, for you personally, with your research and the messages that you want to get out there, what kind of non-academic publications are there out there that you could write for? Okay, because you'll already know probably the academic ones. You'll already perhaps have thought about that. You'll certainly have started to read the kind of journals that you want to be published in. So what I want you to think about is the non-academic publications. Think about general newspapers and magazines. Still, one of my finest hours was getting a small, tiny, tiny square about Gibraltar, of all things, in the Daily Mail. I was really pleased with that, just because it's so hard to do. Think about specialist journals aimed at practitioners. So, for example, in policing, there's 3 or 4 of them that are aimed directly at practitioners, of which Policing Insight is probably aimed at the kind of senior officers or practitioners who are interested in academic research themselves. Jessica makes a really, really good point there. University media, yeah, if you get asked ever by your media people to do something, if you can possibly squeeze it in, then do so, because you've got a whole resource there at your disposal, and they will definitely send it out as press releases. They want to know about your research. They want to get it out there. They'll do this for you. Podcasts is an absolute genius. Yeah, absolutely love that. If you're happy to do podcasts and you're comfortable with them, then certainly do that. The conversation is brilliant. The conversation is particularly brilliant because mainstream newspapers pick them up. Okay, so you may find that you're getting republished in newspapers operating in places that you've never been to. Because it's of interest to their readership. And yes, totally get on a Women's Hour. That's a brilliant ambition. If that's your one takeaway, totally, that's brilliant. Think about blogs. In criminology, there's quite a lot of generalist criminology and criminal justice blogs. Quite a lot of them, although they may be run either by, say, an institution, or they might be run by a single person, what you'll find is they'll quite often allow guest bloggers, and it's worth approaching them. Think about your own institutions. I've mentioned already, they quite often have blogs as well that they'd like you to publish on. If you have institutes, research institutes, they might well have blogs that they want you to publish on. And of course, your professional organisations, which is us, it's the BSc. The BSc has specialist blogs, and it has general blogs, and it has postgraduate blog. I don't think there's an ECR blog yet. I'm not sure. Jayne, is there?
No, there is an ECR blog. No,
I didn't think there was, but the ECRs can feed into the more general ones. So
yeah,
absolutely consider those. These are brilliant stuff in the chat, so that's absolutely fantastic. And yeah, panorama, come on, David, that's just you're just showing us all up. Lovely to see you, Charlotte. See you next time. Like I said, if anybody does need to leave, then please feel free. It's not a problem at all. There's only a few more slides, so I'm not going to keep any of you too long. There are 3 different types, roughly, of writing for non-academic audiences to think about. There are explainers, where there's a complex issue that you think should need simplifying, okay? And that's where you take your expertise and you put it in simple words for a more general audience. What you want to do with those, and probably with all of them, is try to find, again, a hook. Only this time, what you want is a news hook. You want to tie it into something that's going on right now, okay? So, for example, one element which is always good, there's usually something in the news about resources, right? Whatever you're writing on, there's something about resources. There's also perhaps some issues associated at the moment with the pandemic, for example. So I might be thinking about, if I were talking about gambling, for example, I might want to think about, well, what is going to be the knock-on effect of social distancing in betting shops for the way that gambling organisations are going to be trying to push themselves? You know, is there a risk associated with that you could tie in? Having an opinion and taking a stand, so op-eds, blogs are a good place to do this. People are very, very happy for you to bang on about a thing that you think is important to yourself on a blog. And recommendations, calling for a particular action based on your expertise and your research. So this is particularly good for journals that are aimed at practitioners, where you can push for practitioners to start behaving in a different way, or you can push for a particular policy change. So these are all different types of writing that you'll quite commonly see in non-academic publications. And in Policing Insight, for example, we tend to pick up all 3. There are rules, and I speak with 20 years of hard-won knowledge on this. Number 1, remember your audience. They are not academics, okay? This means that you're probably going to have to limit your references. Doesn't mean that you can't have references in there, but you don't want references at the end of every sentence because it's going to make it increasingly hard to read. Some outlets may not want you to put in references at all, which means you have to think about how you present your knowledge. You need it to be direct, you need it to be non-passive, it needs to be action-orientated in the way you express yourself. But also, if you're not allowed or references, or you have to limit your references, you have to think about what claims you can make. Avoid any kind of jargon. So you may well be thinking a lot about neoliberalism, but you have to scrunch that up and throw it in the bin before you even start writing, okay? No jargon whatsoever. It has to be stuff that's going to be understandable to your audiences who aren't interested in anything from academia. There will be some examples when that's not the case, but I can almost guarantee that almost no practitioner outlets, for example, are going to want to know about neoliberalism. Get rid of your acronyms. The very least, you're going to have to spell them out all of the time, so better if you can find a different way of describing them than using an acronym. Try to avoid theory. I know it's a horrible thing to say to us, we love theory, but it's not of interest to non-academic publications by and large, unless you can make it very directly relevant. Don't try to put your literature review into a non-academic publication. Nobody wants to know. In fact, if you're trying to turn a journal article or a possible journal article into something for a non-academic publication, the first thing you can cut is your entire literature review and just throw it away. Although don't throw it away if you actually want to get that published somewhere else. Think about how you're going to speak. If you need to explain something to your mum, you need to explain it here, all right? Unless your mother's an academic, in which case don't do that. And think about the length, the word length. You're really looking at no more than 800 to 1,500 words. I once published in Policing Insight a piece that was 5,000 to 6,000, but that was because it was by Morris Punch, and I just couldn't, it broke my heart to even cut it as far as I had. But that was once in something like 7 years that I published anything that long. For the most part, you're looking at 800 to 1,500 words, and same for a blog, because to be honest, most people aren't going to read much more than that. And most places aren't going to publish much more than that. So If it's 3,000 words and you just can't bear to cut it, maybe you need a personal blog or a university blog rather than trying to get it to a more general audience. And finally, and I can't say this enough, is read the damn publication you're trying to submit to. So many people don't do this. Read the publication, get used to its voice, because each publication is going to have a slightly different voice. It's going to have a slightly different way of talking to its audience. And you want to try to match that. You want to try to be speaking in the voice of the publication that you're sending stuff to. Any questions about the rules of the game? Okay, final bit of homework. What I want you to do is to think about some of the ideas and messages you've developed and actually find some homes for them. All right, that doesn't mean that I'm expecting you to send stuff out like tomorrow, but think about the messages, the stuff that you wanted to get out to people, and think about possible homes for them. So this means that if any of your audiences are practitioners, you need to write a list of the journals and the magazines and the websites that they might look at. Okay, they are out there. Go and find them. Find out the name of the editor, all right, and how to pitch an idea. For example, if you're working in policing and you had an idea for policing, the academic editor is a lady called Carina O'Reilly at policinginsight.com. I thoroughly recommend her. Very nice, very nice. And just draft a short plan for a 1,000-word piece on one of your ideas. Doesn't have to be like in detail. You don't have to write the piece first. All it needs to be is, it's about this. I'm going to cover this, this, and this. I'm going to include this, and then send it off. By pitch it, I mean, dear editor, use their name if you can. I am such and such, I work in this. I've got an idea for a piece, it'll be about this. Would you be interested? That's it, that's all you need to do. Okay, does that sound workable? Does that sound like reasonable homework? Yeah. Yeah?
It does.
Okay, that's everything that I had prepared, which is probably for the best because we're exactly, well, only 6 minutes over, so that's not too bad. I nearly said 6 months, which is probably how late I normally run on these things. So does anybody have any questions, anything they want to feed into, any wider discussions that they want to start? All right. I am available for weddings and bar mitzvahs. Seriously, very welcome to contact me if you do want to ask about anything else. That's my Policing Insight email, but I have many, many others. So you can get hold of me through the BSc or through Anglia Ruskin. And I would say that when you're starting to think about engaging with the public in a wider sense, that you might want to think about things like podcasts, videos, infographics. I mean, really, infographics I think is a great way of getting stuff out. Think about producing, say, a 1-pager or a 2-pager or a 4-pager, summarizing your research and the findings and the key take-homes that you could send out to people, and see what kind of responses you get, and maybe start by producing something like that and sharing it with colleagues or other postgraduates or early career researchers and seeing what they think. So you get a little bit of practice about pulling those two together. And we spoke about asking your media people at the university to take your ideas and your pieces and to send them out there in the form of press releases. You may also have people that can help with the marketing of these things, that might be able to help you draw up those 1-pagers or those infographics. And it's always worth seeing if those facilities are available, because nobody's got anything better to do right now. All right. If there's anybody got any more questions?
No, I think it's important to just echo Anne's point that, really, and Charlotte, really useful presentation, and thanks very much for leading this, because I think it has been really helpful to think about this from a different perspective, and I think the exercises have been useful to really think about our own research and how we might use it and sort of access those audiences that we genuinely want to. So thank you, Carina.
Thanks, Jane, you're lovely. All right then, I will let everybody go, and it has been really, really nice to meet you all, such as it is. Maybe next time it'll be at full conference and we can go and drink some warm white wine.
Thanks, Carina.
All right, bye bye everybody.